We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for? Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And today we're talking about an issue that I didn't even know existed until just recently. And this is a wrinkle on the birth tourism issue. And we've published some on this, but regular birth tourism is when a mother from abroad who is already pregnant comes to the United States, usually on a tourist visa, has the child here, and while she's recovering from childbirth, files the applications for a passport and social security number, and when those come through, then goes back home. Child has no connection to the United States whatsoever, is brought up abroad, and yet is a U.S. citizen and can come and enroll at the University of California at U.S. citizen rates when the time comes, and can petition for the admission of his or her parents when the time comes. So this birth tourism issue, China's seems to be the biggest area where this happens, but it's Nigeria, Russia. There's people from all over the world who use this as a way of getting their kids U.S. citizenship without having to actually move to and live in the United States. But the wrinkle that we're going to be talking about today is surrogacy, is people from abroad paying Americans to carry their children. The children are born here, automatically get citizenship, and then are taken to whatever country the parents were from. And this is even a step beyond the issue of birth tourism in the sense that the 14th Amendment, which is interpreted currently to provide citizenship to anyone born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, that's the language of the amendment, was obviously written when nobody conceived of large-scale, easy international travel. But there still was international travel in the sense that, you got on a boat and came here. But what we're talking about here is a birthright citizenship issue that literally did not even exist technologically at the time. And so it's a fascinating issue that is probably relatively small now, but it's the kind of thing that can grow. And the Heritage Foundation recently did a report on this issue, and I thought it would be great to talk about it. And in studio today, we have the co-author of that report, Emma Waters, who is a senior research associate at the Heritage Foundation, to talk about this. Thank you for coming in, Emma, and talking about this. So if you could at least just first sketch out what is this issue before we get to the implications and the rest of it.
Of course, Mark. Thank you for having me here today. I've been looking forward to this conversation, and I actually have to credit the Center for Immigration Studies for helping me explore this issue when I first came on to Heritage a couple of years ago. I became very interested in commercial surrogacy, how it functions legally in the United States, and spend much of my time working on federal and state policy related to reproductive technology and bioethics. But I became increasingly interested in international commercial surrogacy in particular, as most countries have very strict laws either prohibiting the practice or limiting who can access it. Whereas in the United States, we have no such federal laws governing international commercial surrogacy one way or the other.
And so let me just interrupt briefly, just make clear, the center has we don't do work on this issue of reproductive technologies. We have no position on it one way or the other. I don't even know anything about it. But it's this intersection that matters to us. So what does it mean? What does international commercial surrogacy, what's that even mean?
Yes. So it is a high-tech form of birth tourism where foreign nationals are able to contract with a surrogate in the United States, effectively renting her womb in order to have a child on their behalf. Now, depending on how they go about the process, there is technically the ability for them to send their own reproductive material frozen from their country of origin to the United States. But in many cases, these foreign nationals are coming to the United States working with a surrogacy agency to either purchase egg or sperm or use their own egg and sperm to create an embryo and then implant it in an American surrogate.
Okay.
And this is typical for any surrogacy practice. The main wrinkle here is that these are foreign nationals coming to the United States. And like you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, because of our birthright citizenship laws, based on what the Heritage Foundation would say is a dubious interpretation of the 14th Amendment, these children who are born of an American surrogate but are children of foreign nationals gain and maintain the full rights of U.S. citizenship, even if the parents do not intend to raise them in the United States for any period of time. So in the same case of birth tourism, which you all have written on so well in previous years, parents can then apply for a Social Security card, a passport, gain those markers of citizenship before taking their child back home, even as early as 6 to 12 weeks of age.
Right. And the you pointed out in the report that surrogacy, first of all, the main nationality of people using this are Chinese. It's not quite half, but it's far and away the largest source because there is data on this. Whereas on regular birth tourism, the data is not really very solid, but it still seems that China is the main source. But surrogacy we're talking specifically about surrogacy, China doesn't allow it. And this international surrogacy that this report is about is also banned in Australia, in Canada, in Britain. In other words, this isn't some normal practice that you're, decrying. We're actually kind of an outlier, both in allowing international surrogacy and in automatic birthright citizenship.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So interestingly enough, the United States and Ukraine, and that means Ukraine currently, even through the war with Russia, are seen as international hotspots for commercial surrogacy contracts with foreign nationals.
Ukraine?
Including Ukraine.
Wow.
If you Google Ukraine bomb shelters for birthing, you will see incredibly disturbing pictures of their surrogacy industry continuing on. They said as of 2023, at the same levels as pre-war surrogacy contracts, they just now have their surrogates in bunkers.
Well, business is business, but Ukraine doesn't have automatic birthright citizenship.
No, it doesn't.
And that's the immigration
right,
angle.
Exactly. So it's a lot cheaper in Ukraine, but in the United States, obviously the United States is not in the middle of a war. You have the citizenship factor, and the technology is just more advanced. And so, like I mentioned earlier, because we don't have any federal laws tracking this practice, we don't actually know who these children or their parents are. And we don't have official numbers on how many children are born of these contracts or how many attempts occur each year. But through the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, which is one of the largest fertility organizations in the United States and certainly has a large presence globally, they were able to track data from 2014 to 2020 from some of their clinic reporting systems. And as you mentioned, they found that 47% of all foreign nationals using surrogates in the United States are Chinese nationals. The next two highest nationalities are France at around 9% and Spain at around 8%. But like you mentioned, China completely bans all forms of surrogacy one way or the other. And given their demographic decline that they're experiencing right now, where they're either unable to have children due to fertility issues or their age, or unable to find a partner who's willing to have children, many Chinese nationals have sought refuge in the United States through surrogacy. So this same report actually found that the most common demographic of foreign nationals coming to the U.S. for surrogacy are Asian men over the age of 42. And these are single Asian men, right? Men who were unable to find a female partner who was either able or willing to have children with them.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not couples. Interesting.
Okay. It certainly can be couples, but the most common demographic that they cited in this report was single men.
Wow. Okay.
Of a particular age, too, which I think brings up many questions about the motivation behind the surrogacy contracts, as well as the outcome for the children involved.
Wow. So what are some of the issues here? Obviously, we've talked about the automatic citizenship issue, which is a serious thing. But are there, security angles, that kind of thing to this?
Oh, certainly so. And this is something that I primarily view as a situation of immigration fraud as well as national security risks. Because, as I mentioned, since we don't know who these children or their parents are, we have an untold number of quote unquote citizens who are actually being raised culturally, religiously, geographically in China.
Politically.
Politically, certainly, right? And if we view China as one of the biggest threats to the United States on all levels right now, it's of particular concern that there's untold numbers of Chinese nationals able to fast track their citizenship process through international surrogacy. So concerns include things like the child, once that child gains and maintains the full rights of U.S. citizenship, his or her parents have a fast track to citizenship themselves through a green card visa. And so we actually have reports from NPR, of all places, back in 2014, where a Chinese national said that if you have enough money and you know what you want, you can get anything you want in the United States, including citizenship. And later, another Chinese national went on to say, well, we recognize that either China or the United States is going to be a global leader in the coming decades. So it behooves us to have access to citizenship in either country.
Covering their bets.
Yeah,
basically.
covering their bases, right? And so this makes sense. But then if you think beyond that, what happens when you have children who are raised in China, potentially like politically shaped and infiltrated by the CCP, who then have access to certain educational opportunities, certain research and development jobs, certain security details working for the federal government that are typically reserved for citizens, those who have an allegiance to the United States, but in their case may have no such allegiance because they weren't raised here and really, for all intensive purposes, aren't an American citizen aside from that technical ruling.
Right, yeah. And this has always struck me, this whole issue of regular birth tourism and this wrinkle on birth tourism as raising a very different problem from illegal aliens who live here having kids. It's a whole separate issue. Obviously, we're not talking about that. But, you know, the child of illegal immigrant parents who nonetheless was born here and grows up in the United States does grow up as an American. I mean, you know, there's a whole sort of separate issue of does this create incentives for illegal immigration, all the rest of it. And that's all a real thing. But, you know, if they go through our schools, for better or worse, they're Americans, culturally as well as on paper. Whereas the birth tourism and the sort of surrogacy tourism, or however you refer to this, does create a very different issue because the kids are not growing up, regardless of who their parents are, they're just not growing up as Americans. And I mean, it really is kind of a head scratcher why we allow this. Now, in regular birth tourism, it's actually harder to address because even though, you know, we can instruct consular officers to kind of sort of inquire as to why this, you know, you're 6 months pregnant and why is it again that you want to come to the United States? It's hard to just ban it. Whereas this could be banned, right? I mean, Canada banned it, Britain, Australia banned it. So isn't that really the solution? And the next question is, are there solutions short of that as well?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So to take the second part of the question of are there solutions short of this, one country, such as Australia, limits their birthright citizenship to children who have resided in the country for a decade of unbroken time.
Just to be clear, that's children of people who aren't already
Yes.
citizens or
Yes.
legal residents of Australia. So illegal aliens, tourists, foreign students, whatever, if
Right.
they have kids,
Correct.
there's like a statute of limitations where their kids could get citizenship if they're born there, but only after 10 years of uninterrupted residence.
That's correct.
Which
yes.
makes sense to me. I mean, if we're going to change our rules, that's the way I would like to do it. But that's a heavy lift. It's going to be a long time before we ever get to that.
Right. And it certainly would take a lot to get there. But I think that's a way of sort of balancing these two competing interests where you're not limiting citizenship to only parents who also have citizenship, but you're ensuring that culturally and politically and in all the ways that matter, those children are an American. They do embody your national values. So that's one approach that you can take. But the other approach, just directly addressing the aspect of high-tech birth tourism through international commercial surrogacy, a very straightforward way to go about this, as other countries have, is just simply to prohibit international commercial surrogacy. So either not allowing foreign nationals to access American surrogates here in the United States, or by specifying in our understanding of birthright citizenship that if you're born here through a surrogacy contract, right, without the intention to actually live or remain here for any meaningful period of time, that you would be exempted from citizenship. And again, these are heavy lifts because it would take a pretty substantive change in how we've understood citizenship laws. But given the rapid development of reproductive technology and the changes that we're seeing, and even what it means to be conceived and born, especially with the prospect of things like artificial wombs that
Right.
the FDA is even currently considering certain proposals for, I think it's time for certainly our immigration laws to be updated to reflect these new standards of human development that we're starting to see. So many lawmakers, for example, on the federal level, and as well as some of the states, are interested in what it would look like to prohibit international commercial surrogacy. And like we mentioned, this would actually be on par with what most developed nations have done. And so even thinking about countries like India, Thailand, and Nepal, which used to be, along with Ukraine, sort of international hotspots for cheap and somewhat easy surrogacy arrangements, even they, in the last decade, have changed all of their laws, either totally or almost totally prohibiting international commercial surrogacy, because there were just a number of legal challenges as well as harms to their own citizens that they were noticing as people came in really just for the purpose of harvesting children through women, right? And then leaving without very little consideration of like what was being left behind or, yeah.
And it's not the same thing, but there is an analogy to international adoptions there, because there were a lot of countries that, sort of encouraged it. And I think Guatemala was one example that had been a hot spot, but there was so much abuse of it. Essentially, they were, like you said, harvesting children to bring to the United States. The birthright citizenship issue isn't there, but it is a similar thing, and it's been dramatically restricted. And actually, the number of international adoptions, I think in the immigration statistics, they're listed as orphans. That's the way it's counted in statistics. And there's no numerical limit because the spouses and minor children of U.S. citizens there's no limitation on them, and there shouldn't be. But that was actually the sending countries, if you will, or whatever, dramatically dialed back on that. And it's actually a much smaller phenomenon than it used to be. People I won't presume here, but people in our social class, in sort of educated urbanites, all know, somebody I know adopted a baby from Korea or Colombia or what have you. It was never a very widespread phenomenon, but because of abuses, it's actually significantly smaller. So in my sense, I sense that what you're talking about here, where India, Thailand, et cetera, have responded in a similar way to Guatemala did to the issue of international adoptions on this surrogacy issue.
Yeah, and this is an excellent analogy. Actually, Helen Andrews at the American Conservative has written—
former guest on our podcast.
Yes, a former guest, a simply brilliant woman, has written on this connection between foreign adoptions, particularly adoptions for pay, when that was temporarily how many countries were constructing their adoption laws, and international commercial surrogacy laws, which assumes a high level of money that's going to the surrogate as well as to the agencies that are involved, sometimes reaching as much as $200,000,
wow,
which is still cheaper than many immigration proceedings, as many articles have pointed out,
Sure.
but is certainly a high fee to pay. And so she's written a lot about that analogy, and even just observing the abuses that came from international adoption for pay and the harms that typically wrought on the poorer country that was involved, or at least on the women, the children that were involved in the process, as an analogy to
There's sort
surrogacy.
of a power imbalance there,
Right.
really very clear power.
Exactly, because the cost, and particularly in surrogacy, right? Like if it costs around $200,000 from start to finish, because you're flying to the United States, you're having to pay for lodging while you're here, paying agency fees. For women, the amount that you receive for being a surrogate in the U.S. is around $60,000 on average, but can range as high as even $75,000, which is even higher than the median income for an average American family here in the U.S. And so that requires then the wealthiest of the Chinese nationals or French nationals or Spanish nationals coming to the U.S., which means then there's automatically some sort of power imbalance between those who can access this technology to have children, but also between those who are seeking the service and those who are offering the service through surrogacy, right? Because these are typically women who are in a lower or middle income who are looking for a way to provide for their family that doesn't involve them being in a sort of 9 to 5 corporate workforce or even on top of that, right? Yeah. So even just thinking of like the financial coercion that can be a part of this and the inequality that's a part of it, there's just a lot of concerning factors that come up through this.
Interesting. So short of changing the Constitution or what have you, what are some of the other sort of more targeted measures that Congress or whoever could take, even state legislatures or whatever, to limit this surrogacy tourism issue?
Yeah, so I think the very first step that we should take should be addressing the lack of information and accountability that we have in international surrogacy. So as I mentioned, it's not tracked on the federal level. On the state level, it's up to individual states to decide how they structure their international commercial surrogacy laws. And that's typically viewed as a part of their domestic surrogacy laws too, though they could certainly differentiate between the two. So states like California, for example, where about 75% of these international foreign surrogacy contracts take place, they have a well built out connection with foreign nationals, particularly in China, to really encourage this industry, from the laws that enable it to the agencies, entire boutique agencies that are built out to make this an easy, streamlined process from start to finish. No legal hiccups, no difficulties along the way. And so for states like California, for example, do require clinics to file the number of surrogacy contracts to a state health department. However, once those contracts are filed, their current state law says that no individual may access this information. Similarly, the state of Washington actually requires the intended parent's country of origin to be listed on the birth certificate, accounting for foreign nationals, for example, who may be the intended parents but are not the birthing parents through surrogacy. And so that's required to be recorded and submitted to their state health department. But again, you're not allowed to access it beyond that. So we filed a handful of FOIA requests and are waiting for and looking, hopefully, to get some of that non-identifying data back, just looking at total number of contracts filed, country of origin of the contracts that are filed for the intended parents. And so an easy way on the state level to address that would be to require states to actually publicly report these statistics. So without providing any names or identifying information, right? Just simply say, this is how many surrogacy contracts that were filed every year. This is how many live children were born as a result of these surrogacy contracts. And this was the country of origin of the intended parents. And so even that would provide a massive amount of information that's currently unavailable on the federal or state level across the United States. And so having something like that passed on the federal level, congressionally, or in individual states, I think would be a very strong first step in just providing solid data and information. Because before you can really sell a problem, you need to have solid data to say, here's the full extent of the problem.
Right.
And so studies that we have that we've talked about on the show go a long way toward that, but it's not the same as individual state reporting. So that would be the first step that states could easily implement. And even starting perhaps in states like Texas or Florida that have a high number of surrogacy contracts, but maybe more open to tracking and accountability on that level. And then, of course, as we mentioned, a state could simply ban international commercial surrogacy, saying that of the surrogacy agencies that function in the state, they can only work with domestic intended parents and domestic surrogates, such that at that point, it's a natural limitation where foreign nationals can't contract with these agencies. Now, in states like California, this becomes very tricky. I did a deep dive on all of the fertility clinics in California, and there are many, as the vast majority of surrogacy contracts occur there.
Vast majority in general, or just these
international? So the vast majority of international, but then a large majority of domestic still occur in California. Okay. California probably has the most permissive surrogacy laws generally. And so I'm not sure what the percentages of domestic, but I think California is still the highest domestic location, rivaled by other places like New York and Washington, Florida, and potentially Illinois, from what we've sort of observed from a few different reports. But in California in particular, this would, I think, be a very heavy lift legislatively, because there's so many agencies that are organized with a direct focus on working with Chinese nationals. So there were a number of agencies, like surrogacy agencies, that I list in the report with the Heritage Foundation, that have two language options, English and Mandarin, or some of them that are only offered in Mandarin. Some of them,
they know their market.
Right, exactly. Like they're intending to work with foreign nationals. If you go through the list of people who work there, many of the staff, either administrators, caseworkers, or even some of the fertility doctors, are from mainland China, either receiving their education there, successfully running businesses there before immigrating to the United States, and clearly have very strong ties to China in just their own personal life and history. And what's so fascinating is, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, all forms of surrogacy are expressly prohibited in China. And yet, there are 3 surrogacy agencies that I have linked to in this report that have 2 office locations, one in California and one in mainland China.
Interesting.
And so there's a clear overlap between these 2 countries and the industry that they're formulating here, even opposed to Chinese national law. And I think what I would argue is in the best interest of the United States.
And, in thinking about it, the federal government still has some leverage here because the foreign parent would still have to come and pick up the kid. And it seems to me one simple way of dealing with it is that coming to pick up a surrogate child is not a legitimate reason to apply for a tourist visa. And so you just don't get a visa, so you wouldn't be able to. I mean, I don't know how that would work, if it would work, but it seems to me the federal government still has some leverage there. Well, taking off from your answer about California, that there's basically an industry now. So in a sense, there's sort of a lobby for it, which would make changing the rules there hard. Is that really the case at the federal level? I mean, who would be fighting changes at the federal level to ban it altogether, or at least have reporting requirements or whatever? Has anybody, first of all, even suggested introduce legislation to this effect? And if so, who's against it?
Yes, it's a great question. So we expect to see legislation introduced on the federal level addressing the question of international commercial surrogacy and citizenship, hopefully at the end of this summer, if not going into next year. And there certainly, I think, is a growing interest among America First lawmakers who prioritize and really value what it means to be an American citizenship, and ensuring that American interests are placed ahead of the interests of foreign countries, right? And this has, I think, been an ongoing problem that we can get into in another discussion, right, about Americans placing globalist interests, particularly of China, ahead of the well-being of the people in their own nation. And so I think there's certainly interest among certain lawmakers along those lines, right, who want to ensure that citizenship is preserved and that we're not fueling an industry that actually disadvantages American citizens long-term, either in surrogacy contracts gone wrong, where it's American women who are serving as surrogates who are harmed through the process, or in some cases are left with the children if the foreign nationals don't come to pick up the child or choose not to take the child for whatever the given reason is. And this was obviously a big problem during COVID when there were lots of travel restrictions. So there were cases of surrogate mothers who were actually raising children for as long as about a year at a time because the parents were physically unable to come pick up the child.
But then having given birth to the child, raised the child for a year, it wasn't their kid, basically.
Right. It wasn't legally their kid, right? But it was the child that they had carried and birthed. And so there was a strong connection there, even if it's not a biological relationship.
Right.
So there's interest, I think, federally along those lines, whether that will take the form of addressing the birthright citizenship question directly, which can become very problematic, as you mentioned, when it comes to illegal aliens and who it does and doesn't apply to, or if it will just take the form of addressing international surrogacy. But I've been very encouraged on that front. And I think you could see some states take it up. It's just that the states where it's most likely to happen are the states that are financially benefiting from this the most.
Right.
This is just a highly lucrative industry for states like California and Washington to maintain. And so the financial interest for federal or state lawmakers is, I think, always going to be one of the hardest things to overcome, because you're foregoing potentially a significant amount of money and annual income through this industry.
I mean, that is a perspective that suggests California is not going to change it on its own. But what that means is the federal government needs to address this, because even though California is the biggest state, it's still just one state. It's the kind of thing Congress could address. Because really, if you think about it, whatever you think about the issue of in derogatorily described as renting a woman's womb, that's a whole, again, CIS doesn't get involved in that. But having foreigners rent American wombs does seem one of those things that's hard really to defend once somebody raises it and says they want to stop it. It would be a interesting Senate debate to hear people argue why that's a good thing. And, I think it would boil down to kind of a sort of simplistic libertarian idea that everybody should be able to do whatever they want and people are just meat sacks and all of that. So anyway, that's a whole other issue. But it seems to me this is something that once the light is shined on it is the kind of thing that is likely to be able to be fixed, although we'll see if that's the case. And this report that you co-authored, Emma, is, sort of the first step, it seems to me. And we'll follow this, as we go on. We're going to have links in the show notes to the report. You also had written something in the Federalist last year. We'll probably have a link in there. And then you have links in the report to these NPR reports you talked about and other things. So this is something that is, I think, going to get more attention. We're probably going to hear more about it. And I appreciate your coming in and, sort of introducing not just our listeners, but even just me to this issue. Because, I've been doing this for 30 years and this is another wrinkle of the immigration issue that I only now am learning about. So I appreciate your work and thanks for coming in.
Of course. Thank you so much.
And finally, a few thoughts on the big news of this week that President Biden is stepping aside as the candidate for re-election, and Vice President Harris is the one who's going to be running for president against Trump. And obviously, there's a significant immigration element to this issue. The one that immediately is latched on by a lot of people is that she's border czar and completely failed in that job. This has been a common talking point, and it's basically true. The corporate media has been pushing back with fact checks saying she only had a slice of the immigration issue, that sort of thing. That's preposterous. She was routinely referred to as border czar by the very same media organizations that are now complaining about it. When President Biden gave her this responsibility, he didn't use the word czar because that's not something you get printed on a business card. But he said that she was in charge of dealing with Mexico and Central America in, with regard to the border issue. So, yes, she was border czar. But in a sense, it almost doesn't matter whether or not she was border czar because her positions on other immigration issues are so radical that they require some focus. Our own Todd Bensman wrote a blog post this week entitled Kamala Harris, Immigration Extremist. And it's true. She explicitly came out in favor of decriminalizing border infiltration. In other words, taking away the option of criminal prosecution against border jumpers and leaving it exclusively as a civil violation, which it is in addition to criminal violation now. She essentially played footsie with the idea of abolishing ICE. She was asked specifically about that and responded by saying we needed to start from scratch with regard to immigration enforcement. She's called for an end to private detention facilities, which are a necessary adjunct to government-run detention facilities. Without them, there's no good way to enforce immigration laws. She also was one of the people who raised her hand in favor, during one of the primary debates, in favor of taxpayer-funded health care for illegal immigrants. So she's at the edge, at the fringe of views on immigration policy. But maybe the most important point is that those fringe views are actually now mainstream among elected officials on Democrats. I mean, the Democratic Party itself has radicalized on immigration. A lot of Democratic voters don't buy into this stuff, but at the official level, the elected official and donors and, apparatchiks for the party, it is kind of I won't say kind of, it actually is a litmus test issue to be in favor of unlimited immigration. I think that's a more accurate way of describing it than saying open borders, although, that's good enough for government work. But unlimited immigration is now the only acceptable position on immigration on the left. And Vice President Harris actually reflects that. So it's not so much that she's an outlier, she's actually representative of how extreme the positions, the mainstream positions of the Democratic Party on immigration have become. And we'll see how that debate plays out over the next several months. So until next week, this is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies, signing off for Parsing Immigration Policy. If you have any suggestions, complaints, criticisms, compliments even, just email us at center@cis.org, and I hope you'll tune in next week.